Afternoon. Roll that window all the way down for me. License and registration.
They're right here.
Can you tell me why you stopped me, officer? You rolled straight through that stop sign back on Elm. Didn't even tap the brakes.
I stopped. There was nobody coming.
We'll talk about it. Keep your hands on the wheel
My
for
hands
me.
are right here. I'm cooperating.
Where you heading?
The Saturday morning sun, warm and benevolent, spilled across the manicured lawns of the Oak Creek subdivision. It was the kind of morning that smelled of freshly cut grass and the faint, sweet perfume of blooming azaleas. For David Sterling, it was a scent he was still getting used to, a departure from the concrete and exhaust fumes that had defined his life for so long. Here, in the driveway of his modest but well-kept two-story home, the only smells he cared about were the tangy notes of carnauba wax and the nostalgic aroma of 30-year-old leather. He ran a soft microfiber cloth over the deep cherry-red fender of his 1968 Ford Mustang, a car that was less a machine and more a rolling archive of his life's journey. Every nut and bolt had been turned by his own hands, every imperfection buffed out through years of patient labor. At 42, David had achieved a position that most people, including a younger version of himself, would have deemed impossible. But this morning, he wasn't chief of police. He was just a man, dressed in a grease-stained t-shirt and faded jeans, tending to the one piece of his past that had survived the turbulent journey to his present. The Mustang was his therapy, his connection to the 18-year-old boy who had bought it as a rusted-out shell with his first-ever paycheck. Its throaty, rumbling V8 was the only voice that never questioned him, never judged him, and always responded to his touch with steadfast, mechanical honesty. He was so absorbed in his work, polishing a chrome bumper until it mirrored his focused expression, that he didn't immediately notice the subtle shift in the neighborhood's quiet rhythm. It wasn't a sound, but a feeling, the distinct, prickling sensation of being watched. He paused, the cloth still in his hand, and slowly straightened his back, letting his eyes drift casually across the street. A curtain in the upstairs window of the beige two-story colonial directly opposite his own twitched and then fell still. It was a small thing, easily dismissed. But in David's line of work, he'd learned that the smallest things often carried the most weight. He shrugged it off. He was the new face in a well-established neighborhood, the only black family on a street of predominantly white, upper-middle-class professionals. Curiosity was to be expected. He had moved his wife, Sarah, and their life here for this very piece, for a place where the loudest sound on a Saturday was a distant lawnmower, not a nearby siren. He refused to let paranoia poison it. He leaned back into his work, turning his attention to the driver's side door, checking the alignment. The car was his sanctuary, but it was also, he knew, a statement. It was a classic piece of American muscle, meticulously restored, sitting in the driveway of a home he had earned. To him, it represented the American dream in its purest form. Hard work materialized into something beautiful and enduring. To others, he suspected it might look like a puzzle piece that didn't quite fit the picture. He had spent his entire career navigating those perceptions, learning to read the subtle cues of discomfort, suspicion, and prejudice in the faces of others. He'd hoped, perhaps naively, that he had finally reached a place in his life, in his career, where he could leave that behind, at least within the supposed sanctuary of his own property line. The stillness of the curtain across the street suggested that hope might be premature. He tried to push the feeling aside, focusing on the satisfying click of the door latching shut. He had promised Sarah he would finish the detailing by noon so they could take a drive, maybe head out to the countryside and find a place for a late lunch. It was their first free Saturday in months, a small island of normalcy in the sea of chaos that came with his new job. He was determined to protect it. But as he moved to the front of the car to give the grille one final polish, he felt the gaze again. This time it was more direct. He looked up, and through the shimmering heat rising from the asphalt, he saw two figures standing on their porch across the street. A man and a woman. They weren't pretending to be busy or hiding behind a curtain. They were just standing there, arms crossed, watching him with an unblinking, analytical intensity that was impossible to misinterpret. It was the kind of stare he had seen 1,000 times before. It wasn't simple curiosity, it was assessment, it was judgment. The peaceful Saturday morning was beginning to feel a little less peaceful. Across the street, Chad and Brittany stood on their meticulously swept porch, a silent tribunal of two, to them. Their neighborhood was more than just a collection of houses. It was a curated environment, a fortress of quiet, suburban order they had worked hard to afford. Every pristine lawn, every matching mailbox, was a testament to a shared set of values. The arrival of the new neighbor 2 weeks ago had been a topic of hushed conversation. The moving truck had been the first sign of disruption. Then came the man himself. They didn't know his name, only that he was black, and that he kept to himself. Now, this car. It had been parked in the driveway for a week, a gleaming, almost aggressive splash of red against the muted tones of the neighborhood. Chad, a 38-year-old regional sales manager who believed his success was purely a product of his own merit, crossed his arms. "I'm telling you, Britt, something's not right about this," he murmured, his voice a low rumble of conviction. "Look at that car. That's a '68 fastback, a real one. Do you know what those things are worth in that condition? We're talking 6 figures. Easy." He spoke with the unearned authority of a man who had watched a few car auction shows on television. Brittany, 36, who ran a moderately successful lifestyle blog from a home office that overlooked David's driveway, adjusted the designer sunglasses perched on her nose. "He's been out there for 2 hours. Chad, just wiping it and looking around. It's weird." Her world was one of aesthetics and appearances, and the scene across the street clashed with the carefully constructed narrative of her life. In her blog, she wrote about creating safe, harmonious spaces. The man and his car felt like a discordant note. "It's not weird, it's suspicious," Chad corrected. "Think about it. Who just shows up in a neighborhood like this, with a car like that, and no one knows who he is? He's probably not even from here. He's probably casing the place." The logic was a tangled mess of assumption and stereotype. But in their minds, it was a straight line. They saw a black man and a luxury item, and their brains, conditioned by a lifetime of subtle and not-so-subtle media portrayals, filled in the rest of the narrative. The narrative was crime. "Should we call someone?" Brittany asked, her hand instinctively going to the smartphone in the pocket of her yoga pants. "The non-emergency line, maybe?" "And say what? There's a guy polishing a car?" Chad scoffed, though the idea appealed to him. "No. We need something more concrete. We can't look like we're just being, you know." He left the word racist unsaid. In their minds, they weren't racist. They were prudent. They were proactive community members. They were protecting their investment. "Look at him," Chad continued, his eyes narrowing. "He's dressed like a mechanic, but he's working on a $100,000 car in a $1 million neighborhood. The math doesn't add up. The fact that David's house was comparable in value to their own, or that a person might enjoy working on their own car as a hobby, were details their chosen narrative couldn't accommodate. They had seen what they wanted to see, and every subsequent action from David was filtered through that lens of suspicion. His focused work was interpreted as nervous energy. His occasional glance around the quiet street was surveillance. His very presence was an anomaly they felt compelled to solve. "I'm going to go talk to him," Chad announced, his jaw set. The decision inflated his chest with a sense of civic duty. He wasn't just a sales manager now. He was a watchman, a guardian of the block. "What are you going to say?" Brittany asked, a flicker of anxiety in her voice. "I'll just be neighborly. Ask about the car, feel him out," Chad said, already walking down the porch steps. "You stay here. Keep your phone ready, just in case." The words, "just in case," hung in the air, pregnant with imagined possibilities. Brittany watched her husband march across the asphalt, a man on a mission, convinced he was about to bravely confront a potential threat. She clutched her phone, her thumb hovering over the keypad. She wasn't just an observer. She was a participant, ready to escalate their shared suspicion into an official report. Across the street. David Sterling had just finished polishing the grill and was preparing to put his supplies away. He saw the man from the beige house walking towards him with a purposeful stride and braced himself. The time for quiet observation, it seemed, was over. The confrontation he had hoped to avoid was now walking directly up his driveway. David watched Chad approach, his mind automatically cataloging the man's body language. The walk was a little too confident, the shoulders pushed back a little too far. It was the posture of a man who wasn't coming to introduce himself, but to assert himself. David remained where he was, standing beside the Mustang's front fender, and waited. He placed his microfiber cloth on the roof of the car and kept his hands visible and relaxed at his sides. It was a habit, ingrained from years of training and experience in any uncertain encounter. Project Calm. Show you are not a threat. "Morning," Chad said as he stepped onto the concrete driveway. His tone was a carefully crafted blend of casual friendliness and underlying interrogation. He stopped a few feet away, creating a zone of personal space that was just slightly too large for a truly friendly chat. "Good morning," David replied, his voice even and steady. He offered a slight nod, but not a smile. He would be polite, but he would not feign a warmth he did not feel. Chad's eyes swept over the Mustang, a look of faux admiration on his face. "That's one hell of a machine you got there," he said. "A 68, right? Fastback?" "That's right," David confirmed. "Wow. You don't see many of these around anymore, especially not in this condition." Chad continued, circling the car slowly, as if he were an inspector. "This thing must have cost a pretty penny, and is it a rest-a-mod, or did you keep it original?" The questions were coming too fast, too specific. This wasn't small talk. It was a deposition disguised as a hobbyist's curiosity. "It's a mix," David said simply, offering no further details. He wasn't going to provide a line-by-line accounting of his car to a stranger in his own driveway. Every question Chad asked was a subtle test, a search for an inconsistency in a story that only existed in Chad's head. Chad stopped at the rear of the car, peering at the license plate. "Just moved into the neighborhood, huh? Haven't seen you around." "We moved in a couple of weeks ago," David said. "I'm David." He offered his name, a standard piece of neighborly protocol, to see if the gesture would be returned. It was not. Chad ignored the introduction completely. "Right. So, this is your car, then?" he asked, the question hanging in the air with the weight of an accusation. A faint weariness settled over David. It was a feeling he knew well, a bone-deep exhaustion that came from having to constantly justify his own existence. "Yes," he said, the single word firm and clear. "It's my car." "Huh," Chad grunted, the sound dripping with skepticism. He walked back to the front of the car, closer to David this time. It's just, you know, it's a nice neighborhood. We all kind of look out for each other. We've had a few break-ins in the area over the last year. People's garages getting hit. High-end stuff going missing. He was no longer even pretending to talk about the car. He was drawing a direct line from his suspicion to David's presence. "I appreciate the concern," David said, his voice remaining level, betraying none of the irritation that was beginning to simmer beneath the surface. "But as I said, this is my car, and it's parked in my driveway. Everything's in order here." Chad let out a short, humorless laugh. Right, in order." He gestured vaguely at David's clothes. "You do this for a living? Restorations?" The question was a naked probe into his financial status. Another attempt to make the math add up in his prejudiced equation. This was the line. David had been polite. He had been patient, but he would not be interrogated on his own property. "My profession is not relevant to this conversation," he said, his tone shifting. The quiet patience was gone, replaced by a cool, hard finality. "I was enjoying my morning. If you'll excuse me?" He turned slightly, a clear non-verbal signal that the interaction was over. The dismissal caught Chad off guard. He had expected nervousness, or perhaps anger, or a fumbled explanation. He had not expected this calm, articulate assertion of a boundary. It didn't fit the profile he had created. Instead of backing down, it solidified his suspicion. In his mind, an innocent man would be eager to please, to explain himself. This calm defiance, it was the confidence of a man who had something to hide. "Hey, look, I'm just trying to be a good neighbor," Chad said, his own voice taking on a defensive edge. "No need to get hostile." "No one is being hostile," David corrected him. "I'm simply finished with this conversation. Have a good day." He turned his back completely and picked up his detailing supplies, preparing to take them into the garage. Chad stood there for a moment, flustered and angry. He had been dismissed. His authority, which he had assumed was a given in this situation, had been completely ignored. He turned and stomped back across the street, his face a mask of indignation. As he reached his own lawn, he looked back and saw David watching him. He gave a sharp, angry nod towards his wife on the porch. It was a signal. The time for neighborly chats was over. It was time to call in the professionals. Brittany saw the look on Chad's face as he stormed back across the street and knew immediately that his neighborly conversation had failed. His jaw was tight, and his cheeks were flushed with a mixture of anger and righteous indignation. He didn't have to say a word. He was completely evasive. Chad hissed as he mounted the porch steps. I asked him straight up if it was his car, and he got all defensive, refused to tell me what he does for a living, basically told me to get lost. "So he's not a neighbor?" Brittany asked, her voice hushed with a manufactured sense of dread. "He might live in that house, but he's not one of us," Chad declared, the distinction clear and damning in his mind. "He's hiding something. I'm sure of it." He was arrogant, condescending, a real piece of work. "You see the way he just turned his back on me?" To Chad, this wasn't just a rebuff, it was a profound sign of disrespect, a challenge to his perceived status. "What do we do?" Brittany asked, though she already knew the answer. She was looking for his permission, his final push to transform their suspicion into official action. "You're doing it," Chad said, gesturing towards the phone she was clutching. "Call them. Now. Before he decides to take off." All of Brittany's hesitation evaporated, replaced by a surge of adrenaline. This was no longer just a vague suspicion. It was a clear and present danger, a narrative she now fully believed. She turned away from the street, shielding her phone as if to protect the call's integrity. and dialed 911. Her voice, when she spoke, was a masterful performance. It shed its normal, calm tone and adopted a higher, more frantic pitch, laced with a tremor of carefully cultivated fear. "Yes. Hello? I need police. Quickly," she began, her words tumbling out. "I'm at 114 Willow Creek Lane. There's a man. He's in my neighbor's driveway, trying to steal a car, a classic red Mustang." She paused, listening to the dispatcher's calm, procedural questions. "No, I don't know the owners. They just moved in." She lied, feigning ignorance of David's residency to strengthen her claim. "This man, he doesn't look like he belongs here. He's been here for hours, acting very suspicious. My husband went to talk to him just to ask if everything was okay, and he became incredibly aggressive." This was the crucial fabrication, the lie that would change the entire dynamic of the response. The word aggressive was a specific trigger, a piece of jargon she knew from watching countless crime shows. It was designed to elevate the situation from a potential property crime to a potential threat against a person. The dispatcher asked for a description. "He's a black man," she said, her voice dropping slightly as if she were afraid to be overheard. "Tall, maybe early 40s. He's wearing a t-shirt and jeans. He's still there. He's yelling now." She glanced over her shoulder. David was calmly putting a lid on a can of wax. He was silent. The lie was brazen, a complete invention designed to add urgency and danger to the scenario. "I'm scared. He seems very unstable," she continued, her voice cracking with manufactured emotion. "My husband said he saw tools. I think he might have a weapon. I don't feel safe. Please, just send someone. Hurry." The word weapon was the final ugly flourish. She had now painted a picture not of a potential car thief, but of a dangerous, aggressive, and possibly armed felon. She was no longer just reporting a suspicion. She was crafting a specific police response, ensuring the officers would arrive with their adrenaline high and their assumptions already set in stone. She ended the call, taking a deep, theatrical breath. "They're on their way," she announced to Chad, her expression a mixture of fear and grim satisfaction. "They said to stay inside and not engage with him further." Chad nodded, a look of approval on his face. "Good. You did the right thing. Britt, we can't have people like that thinking they can just come into our neighborhood and do whatever they want." They retreated into their living room, peering through the pristine blinds of their front window, now a secure observation post. They had set the trap. They had called the authorities to restore their version of order. Now, all they had to do was wait and watch as the gears of the system, which they had so confidently set in motion with a series of calculated lies, began to turn. Across the street, David Sterling, blissfully unaware of the danger hurtling towards him, closed his garage door and decided to get a glass of water before taking his car for a well-earned drive. The sound arrived before the car did. It began as a faint, distant siren that quickly grew into a piercing, insistent wail, tearing through the Saturday morning tranquility. David was in his kitchen, rinsing his glass at the sink, when he heard it. He froze. In his line of work, the sound of a siren was an immediate call to attention, a sound that bypassed the ears and went straight to the gut. He instinctively looked out the kitchen window toward the street. The sound grew louder, closer, until it was right on top of him. A black and white patrol car from the Oak Creek Police Department, lights flashing in a frantic red and blue rhythm, swung onto his street and screeched to a halt directly in front of his driveway, its tires barking against the hot asphalt. It was parked at an angle, a tactical move designed to block the Mustang and establish immediate control. David felt a cold knot form in his stomach. He knew, with a certainty that left no room for doubt, that they were here for him. There was no other explanation. The stares from the neighbors, the confrontational questions from the man across the street, and now this. The sequence was as predictable as it was depressing. He placed his glass deliberately on the counter, took a slow, steadying breath, and walked out his front door, letting the screen door click shut behind him. He needed to meet this head-on, out in the open. Two uniformed officers emerged from the patrol car, their movements sharp and synchronized. The senior officer, a man in his late 30s with a stocky build and a face set in a permanent scowl, was Officer Keegan. He had been on the force for a decade, and the job had sanded away any hint of optimism he might have once possessed. His hand rested on his duty belt, a casual posture that radiated readiness. His partner, Officer Shaw, was younger, barely in his mid-20s, with the lean, eager look of a man still trying to prove himself. He mirrored Keegan's stance, but with more rigidity, his eyes wide as he scanned David from head to toe, his brain already processing the information from the 911 call, aggressive, possibly armed. As the officers took their positions, Chad and Brittany emerged from their front door, their roles as concerned citizens now fully realized. They hurried to the edge of their lawn, meeting the officers as if they were liberators. "Thank God you're here," Brittany said, her voice filled with a breathless, theatrical relief. "That man, right there." She pointed a trembling finger across the street at David. "He was trying to steal that car. He got really aggressive when my husband confronted him." Officer Keegan's gaze was fixed entirely on David. He didn't acknowledge the couple beyond a brief nod. He had his target. He and Shaw began to walk across the street, not side by side, but fanned out, creating a classic 2-on-1 triangulation to limit David's movement. "That's him," Chad added, his voice booming with the newfound confidence of having official backup. "We caught him red-handed. He refused to answer any questions, acted real suspicious." Keegan stopped at the edge of the driveway, about 15 feet from David. His partner flanked him to the right. "Sir," Keegan said, his voice flat and devoid of any curiosity, "I'm going to need you to put your hands on your head and step away from the vehicle." It was not a request. It was a command, delivered with the unshakable assumption of David's guilt. David stood his ground on the walkway leading to his front door. He kept his hands open and visible. "Good morning, officers," he said, his voice calm and clear, a stark contrast to the agitated tones of his accusers. "There's been a misunderstanding here." "There's no misunderstanding," Officer Shaw chimed in, his voice sharp and high-strung. "We got a call about a man matching your description attempting to steal a vehicle. Now do as my partner said. Hands on your head. Now." The speed of the escalation was breathtaking. In less than 60 seconds, David had gone from a homeowner enjoying his Saturday to a felony suspect being commanded at gunpoint on his own property. The officers had made no attempt to investigate. They hadn't asked him for his side of the story. They hadn't even looked at the car. They had arrived on scene, absorbed the narrative fed to them by the 911 call and the couple, and immediately moved to neutralize the perceived threat. And the perceived threat, as it always was in these situations, was him. He wasn't being investigated. He was being processed. The cage of prejudice, which had been under construction all morning, had just been slammed shut. David did not put his hands on his head. To do so would be to accept their premise, to concede to being a suspect in his own driveway. He kept his hands open and visible, a clear sign of non-aggression, and held Officer Keegan's gaze. "Officers, I understand you're responding to a call," he said, his voice a pillar of calm in the swirling vortex of accusation. "But the information you received is false. My name is David Sterling. I own this home, and I own this vehicle. The people who called you are mistaken. His refusal to immediately comply, no matter how calmly stated, was like gasoline on a fire. From the officer's perspective, innocence was synonymous with compliance. Resistance, even verbal, was a clear indicator of guilt. Kagan's jaw tightened. "Sir, I'm not going to tell you again. Step away from the car and put your hands on your head. You are failing to obey a lawful order. I am not stepping away from my property, and I am not a threat to you." David replied evenly. "The only crime that has been committed here is the filing of a false police report by that couple across the street." He gestured with his head towards Chad and Brittany, who were watching with rapt attention, their expressions triumphant. "He's arguing with them. See, what did I tell you?" Brittany commented loudly from her safe vantage point. Officer Shaw took a step closer, his hand moving from his belt to rest on the grip of his holstered firearm. The gesture was a deliberate escalation, a visual threat. "We'll sort out the details later, right now. You are obstructing our investigation." "What investigation?" David asked, his tone genuinely curious. The question seemed to momentarily stump them. "You haven't investigated anything. You haven't asked a single question to ascertain the facts. You arrived and immediately treated me like a criminal. You haven't even run the license plate on the vehicle you believe is being stolen." He was offering them the most basic, fundamental first step of any suspected auto theft investigation. It was Procedure 101, a simple action that would take less than 30 seconds and could resolve the entire situation. He was pointing out their failure to do their job, and they did not appreciate it. "We'll run the plates when we're ready," Keegan snapped, his frustration growing. "Right now, you're the one being uncooperative. Why are you being so defensive if you have nothing to hide?" "I am not being defensive," David corrected him precisely. "I am defending my rights. There's a difference. You have no probable cause to believe a crime has been committed. You only have a hysterical phone call from people who have a problem with me being in their neighborhood." The directness of the accusation hit a nerve. Shaw scoffed audibly. "Oh, here we go. Pulling the race card already." The statement was so unprofessional, so utterly revealing of the bias underpinning their actions, that David almost couldn't believe it. They weren't just thinking it. They were saying it out loud. They had abandoned even the pretense of impartiality. The entire interaction was being filtered through their preconceived notions, fed and validated by the lies of the 911 call. They were not peacekeepers or investigators. They were enforcers, sent to put him, the anomaly, back in his place. "This isn't about a card." "Officer," David said, his voice still low and steady but with a new edge of steel. "This is about the facts. And the fact is, the quickest way to the truth is to run the plate on that Mustang. The registration will come back to me. David Sterling. The address on the registration will be this address. It's a simple, verifiable fact that you are actively choosing to ignore. The question is, why?" He had cornered them, not with aggression, but with simple, irrefutable logic. He had exposed the flaw in their procedure, the gaping hole in their investigation. They could not answer his question without admitting that they had been driven by assumption rather than evidence. And so, they did what people in their position often do when their authority is challenged by the truth. They defaulted to threats and brute force. Kagan took another step forward, closing the distance between them. "I've had enough of your back talk. This is your final warning. Hands on your head, or I'm going to put them there for you." The air in the driveway grew thick with tension. The sun beat down on the black asphalt, the heat of physical presence. The officers, rebuffed by logic, now shifted their tactics, falling back on a line of questioning designed not to uncover facts, but to reinforce their suspicions and challenge David's legitimacy. "All right, let's try this a different way," Officer Keegan said, his tone dripping with condescension. He gestured towards the gleaming Mustang. "You say this is your car. It's a pretty expensive piece of machinery. What do you do for a living?" The question was so wildly outside the bounds of a car theft investigation that it was almost absurd. It was the exact same question Chad had asked. Born from the exact same prejudice, the idea that a man like David couldn't possibly have earned something of this value. It was a challenge disguised as a question, an interrogation of his socio-economic status. "My occupation has nothing to do with this situation," David stated firmly. "It has no bearing on whether I own this house or that car." "See, he's being evasive," Chad shouted from across the street, emboldened by the officer's line of questioning. "Guilty people do that. They try to confuse you." Keegan didn't silence him. He didn't tell the civilian to stay out of it. He allowed the biased commentary to become part of the official record, a Greek chorus validating his own flawed investigation. He turned his full attention back to David. "Sir, it would be a whole lot easier for everyone involved if you just cooperated. It's a simple question. What do you do?" And it's a completely irrelevant one. "Officer," David repeated, his patience being stretched to its absolute limit. "The way to resolve this is to determine ownership of the vehicle. Nothing else matters. Not my job, not my income, not what my neighbors think of me." He was trying to steer them back to the facts, but they were determined to stay in the murky waters of assumption and prejudice. Officer Shaw, emboldened by his partner's approach, decided to add his own insidious layer to the interrogation. "You just move into this neighborhood? It's a nice area? Pricey? You renting this place?" he asked, his eyes scanning David's home with a look of overt skepticism. It was another staggering breach of protocol. They were now questioning his residency, implying he was a transient, a squatter, someone who simply did not belong. The accusation of car theft was becoming a broader indictment of his entire existence on this street. "This is my home," David said, his voice low and dangerous. He could feel the anger, an emotion he had spent a lifetime learning to control, beginning to rise. He recognized this tactic for what it was, an attempt to provoke him, to push him until he broke, until he yelled or made a sudden move that they could then use as justification for a physical escalation. They wanted him to become the aggressive man from the 911 call, and they were trying their damnedest to create him. He took a slow, deliberate breath, forcing the anger back down. He would not give them what they wanted. He would not become their stereotype. "Officers," he said, shifting his strategy. He would no longer debate the relevance of their questions. He would make a simple, declarative statement. "My identification is in my wallet, in my back right pocket. It will confirm my name is David Sterling. It will show my address as 112 Willow Creek Lane. It will prove I am who I say I am. You have my permission to retrieve it." It was a concession, but a tactical one. He was trying to de-escalate, to give them a way out, a path back to actual police work. Keegan and Shaw exchanged a quick, almost imperceptible glance. They had him on the defensive. They believed they were in total control. "All right," Keegan said, a smirk playing on his lips. "Don't you move a muscle, don't you even twitch." He then looked at his partner. "Shaw, go ahead and get his ID." Shaw started to move forward, a triumphant look in his eyes. He was about to physically put his hands on David, to search him, to exercise a dominance that he clearly felt was his right. The humiliation was the point. But before he could take a second step, Keegan held up a hand, stopping him. A new thought had occurred to him, a new angle to play based on the dispatcher's report. "Hang on a second," Keegan said, his eyes narrowing as he stared at David's waistline. The call mentioned you might be armed. Are you carrying a weapon right now? Sir? The focus had shifted again, from property and identity to the far more volatile issue of a firearm. A word that, in this context, was a loaded stick of dynamite. The question about a weapon changed the atmosphere instantly. It introduced a new, more lethal element into the standoff. David knew this was a critical juncture. His answer had to be perfect, calm, truthful, and non-threatening. Any hint of evasion or agitation could be misinterpreted as confirmation of a threat, giving the officers the pretext they were so clearly searching for. "I am legally licensed to carry a firearm," David said, his voice steady and clear. "And yes, I am lawfully armed at this moment. The firearm is secured in a holster on my right hip, under my shirt. I have not reached for it, and I have no intention of doing so." He stated the facts without emotion, delivering the information as a simple report. He kept his hands open and away from his body, his posture deliberately non-threatening. The confirmation of a gun seemed to energize the officers, especially Shaw. "See!" he exclaimed to Keegan, as if he had just solved a major piece of the puzzle. "The caller was right. He's armed." The fact that David had stated it was a legal, licensed firearm was completely lost on him. In his mind, the presence of a gun on this man automatically validated the entire suspicious narrative. "This is getting ridiculous," David said, shaking his head slowly. The surreal nature of the situation was beginning to feel like a fever dream. "I am the legal owner of this home. I am the legal owner of that car. I am the legal owner of a registered firearm. I have broken no laws. I have done nothing wrong. Am I being detained, or am I free to go?" It was a formal question, a legal trigger that required a specific answer. It forced the officers to define the nature of the encounter. Were they simply investigating, or had he been deprived of his liberty? Kagan's face was a thundercloud of frustration. He was cornered by the facts, by the law, and by his own escalating rhetoric. He couldn't arrest David for stealing a car he clearly owned, but he couldn't simply walk away either. That would be a surrender, an admission that he had been wrong from the very beginning. So, he chose the only option his ego would allow, a pure, unadulterated assertion of authority. "You're being detained," Kagan snapped, "for investigation of auto theft and for your suspicious and uncooperative behavior." The justification was flimsy, a house of cards built on a foundation of lies and prejudice, and David knew it. "Suspicious behavior is not a crime. Officer," he stated, his voice like steel, "and I have cooperated to the extent that is legally required of me. You have ignored all exculpatory evidence and refused to perform the most basic elements of an investigation. This is not a lawful detention. This is harassment." This direct challenge to his authority was more than Keegan could handle. The last vestiges of his professional composure crumbled away. "You're getting real close to finding out what obstruction of justice feels like," he warned, his voice a low growl. He pointed a finger at David. "I gave you an order when we arrived. Step away from the car. You refused. Now, I'm ordering you again. Get over here, by my patrol car. Now." He was trying to move David off his own property, to isolate him, to place him in a more vulnerable position next to the police vehicle. It was a classic control tactic. David stood his ground. He did not move. "I am not going to move to your patrol car," he said, his voice impossibly steady. "I have committed no crime. This is my property. You have no legal right to order me off of it without a warrant or probable cause of a crime, which you do not have." Each calm, legally precise sentence was a blow against the officer's fragile authority. He was not just defying them. He was educating them on the limits of their power. And he was doing it in a way that was public and irrefutable. The officers were used to dealing with people who were scared, angry, or ignorant of the law. They were not used to dealing with someone who was calm, articulate, and who clearly understood the legal boundaries of their interaction better than they did. "That's it," Keegan declared, his face red with fury. He had been backed into a corner by a man who refused to be intimidated, a man who was using the law as a shield against the officer's own unlawful behavior. He saw only one way to regain control and save face. He unclipped the handcuffs from his belt. The metallic click was loud and ominous in the quiet air. "I've had enough of your law school lesson. You're under arrest." The words "you're under arrest" hung in the hot, still air. Across the street, Chad and Brittany watched with wide-eyed excitement. This was it. This was the validation they had been waiting for, the tangible consequence of their phone call. They were about to witness the man they had falsely accused being put in chains. For them, it was the ultimate proof that they had been right all along. Officer Keegan took a decisive step forward, the handcuffs held ready in his hand. Officer Shaw moved in from the side, a synchronized tactic to flank and overwhelm. The threat was no longer verbal. It was imminent and physical. David knew he was at the precipice. A physical altercation, even one he did not initiate, would change everything. It would give the officers the justification they so desperately craved. Any resistance, even a natural reaction to being grabbed, would be twisted into resisting arrest. The narrative would be irrevocably muddied. He would no longer be the calm, articulate homeowner defending his rights. He would become just another resisting suspect. His entire career, his entire life, had been a study in de-escalation, in using words and intellect to diffuse violence, not incite it. He had one final card to play. It was a long shot, a move that would likely infuriate the officers even more in the short term. But it was his only hope of preventing a disastrous physical outcome. "For what crime, officer?" David demanded, his voice rising slightly for the first time, sharp and clear, cutting through Keegan's forward momentum. "You are legally required to articulate the specific crime you believe I have committed to justify this arrest." "Obstruction, interfering with an investigation," Shaw supplied eagerly, as if he'd been waiting for the prompt. "There is no lawful investigation to obstruct," David shot back, his gaze locked on Keegan. "You have ignored every piece of evidence that proves my innocence. You are not investigating. You are perpetrating a false arrest. And you know it." Keegan didn't hesitate. He was past the point of legal debate. "I'm giving you a lawful order. Turn around and place your hands behind your back. Now!" He reached out, his hand aiming for David's arm. This was the moment, the point of no return. David took one quick, deliberate step backward, creating space. "Stop!" he commanded, his voice imbued with a sudden, powerful authority that momentarily froze both officers in their tracks. It wasn't the shout of a cornered suspect. It was the sharp, clear command of a man in charge. They paused, momentarily confused by the unexpected shift in tone. In that brief, crucial pause, David made his final move. He looked past the two officers, making direct eye contact with Chad and Brittany, who were still watching from their lawn. He then swept his gaze across the street to another neighbor who had emerged onto his porch. Drawn by the commotion, he was establishing his witnesses. "I will not turn around," he said, his voice ringing with absolute finality. "I have done nothing wrong. I am not resisting. But I will not be a party to my own unlawful arrest." He then turned his gaze back to Keegan, whose face was a mask of disbelief and rage. "I am now formally requesting that a supervising officer be called to this scene immediately." The request landed with the force of a physical blow. It was a perfect, unexpected counterpunch. For officers in the field, The request for a supervisor is a loaded one. It is a direct challenge to their competence, an official accusation that they are incapable of handling a situation correctly. In the minds of officers like Keegan and Shaw, only guilty people or professional cop watchers made such a demand. Keegan let out a short, derisive laugh, but it was hollow. "Oh, you're requesting a supervisor now? You don't get to make demands." "It is not a demand," David stated, his language precise and deliberate. "It is a formal request under the Oak Creek Police Department's own protocols. I believe your conduct has been unprofessional. Your investigation has been biased, and you are attempting to make a false arrest. Therefore, I am exercising my right to have a supervisor present to witness your actions." He wasn't just complaining, he was citing policy. He was building a verbal record, not just for his own defense, but for the inevitable internal affairs investigation that would follow. The threat of immediate violence had been met not with a fist, but with a deep and intricate knowledge of the very system the officers represented. They were trapped, and the handcuffs in Keegan's hand suddenly felt very, very heavy. Officer Keegan stood frozen for a moment, the request for a supervisor hanging in the air like a formal indictment. His rage was still simmering, but it was now competing with a new, unwelcome feeling: hesitation. Department policy was clear. If a citizen makes a formal request for a supervisor and the scene is not an active, violent threat, one is supposed to be called to refuse, especially in a situation that was already tense and being witnessed by other civilians, would be a serious procedural violation. It would be an admission that he had something to hide. Officer Shaw, less experienced and more impulsive, didn't grasp the tactical predicament. "We don't need a supervisor to handle you," he blustered, trying to regain their lost momentum. "Apparently, you do," David replied coolly. The simple, logical retort further exposed the weakness of their position. From across the street, the other neighbor who had been watching from his porch, a middle-aged man David didn't know, seemed to have heard the exchange. "He's right," the man shouted, his voice cutting through the tension. "Get a sergeant out here. These two are way out of line." That public reinforcement sealed it. Keegan knew he could no longer refuse. To do so would make him look guilty of exactly what David was accusing him of. With a look of pure venom directed at David, he turned away slightly, his movements jerky with anger, and lifted the radio microphone from his shoulder. His voice, when he spoke to the dispatcher, was clipped and dripping with resentment. "Dispatch, send a supervisor to 112 Willow Creek Lane," he said. He paused, choosing his words carefully, still trying to frame the narrative in his favor. "We have an uncooperative subject in a possible 1053. Situation is contained." He released the transmit button with a sharp click and turned back to David, his eyes promising retribution. "He's on his way," Keegan said, his voice hard. "But don't you think for a second this changes anything? When my sergeant gets here, I'm going to tell him you've been obstructive, belligerent, and uncooperative from the moment we arrived. This isn't going to go the way you think it is." "I'm not expecting it to go my way, officer," David said calmly. "I'm expecting it to go the correct way, the way dictated by the law and by your own department's policies. There's a difference." The threat of immediate physical arrest had subsided, replaced by a tense, uncomfortable waiting game. Keegan and Shaw stood their ground, refusing to relax their intimidating postures. They kept David isolated in his own driveway, a suspect on public display. The handcuffs were no longer in Keegan's hand, but they were still clipped to the front of his belt, a constant, silent reminder of how close he had come to using them. Across the street, Chad and Brittany shuffled their feet, the delay deflating their sense of a triumphant climax. This wasn't the swift, decisive action they had envisioned. The situation had become complicated. bogged down in procedure. "What's taking so long?" Chad muttered to his wife. "They should have had him in the back of that car 10 minutes ago." The other neighbor remained on his porch, a silent, unmoving witness. His presence had subtly shifted the dynamic. It was no longer just the officer's word against David's. There was an impartial observer. David remained perfectly still, his breathing even, his posture relaxed but alert. He had successfully de-escalated the immediate threat of violence. He had forced a procedural check on the officer's unchecked power. He had bought himself time. But he knew the battle was far from over. Everything now depended on the kind of man the responding supervisor would be. Would he be a clone of Keegan, interested only in backing his officers, right or wrong? A man who would see a complaint from a black man against 2 white officers as an attack on the entire Brotherhood of Blue? Or would he be a man interested in the truth? A man who followed procedure not just when it was convenient, but when it was right. The fate of the entire encounter, and quite possibly his career and his freedom, now rested on the shoulders of the unknown sergeant who was, at that moment, driving toward the carefully constructed cage in his driveway. The 5 minutes it took for the supervisor to arrive felt like an hour. The silence in the driveway was a heavy, suffocating blanket, punctuated only by the crackle of the police radio and the distant drone of a passing airplane. Keegan and Shaw kept their gazes locked on David, their expressions a hardened mask of resentment. They stood like statues, refusing to give an inch, their presence a constant, oppressive weight. They were committed to their narrative, and the arrival of a sergeant was, in their minds, a mere formality before they would be vindicated. David, in turn, remained on his walkway, a calm island in a sea of hostility. He used the time to mentally rehearse, to go over every detail of the encounter, every word spoken, every action taken. He knew that when the sergeant arrived, the first few moments would be critical. He would have one chance to present his side of the story clearly and concisely, to cut through the inevitable spin from the officers. He cataloged their failures: failure to separate the parties, failure to investigate, failure to run the license plate, an improper line of questioning, unlawful commands, and a baseless threat of arrest. The list was long and damning, across the street. Chad's frustration was starting to boil over into a new performance. He began pacing back and forth on his lawn, speaking loudly to his wife, but intending his words for the other neighbor and for the officers to hear. "This is unbelievable," he declared. "The guy is clearly guilty, and he's playing the system. A real smooth talker. That's how they are. They know all the tricks to get away with things." The "they" was not lost on anyone. It was another dog whistle, another attempt to paint David with the broad, ugly brush of racial stereotype. Brittany, however, was beginning to look uneasy. The initial adrenaline rush of the 911 call had worn off, replaced by a gnawing anxiety. This was dragging on. More people were watching. The clean, simple narrative of heroic couple stops a car thief was becoming messy and complicated. She just wanted it to be over. Finally, a marked police SUV, distinguished by the 3 sergeant stripes on its rear panel, turned onto the street. It moved without the urgency of the first patrol car, its approach measured and deliberate. The driver, Sergeant Wallace, was a man David knew, at least by reputation. Wallace was an old-timer, a cop from a different era who had somehow managed to adapt and survive through decades of departmental changes. He was known for being methodical, by the book, and possessing a temper that was slow to rouse but formidable when it was. He was, in short, exactly the kind of supervisor David had hoped would respond. The SUV parked a short distance away, not boxing anyone in, but taking a neutral, observational position. Sergeant Wallace stepped out. He was a tall, lean man in his late 50s, with short, graying hair and a face etched with the lines of long experience. His eyes, before they landed on anyone, scanned the entire scene, the position of the patrol car, the posture of his officers, the civilian witnesses, and David, standing alone by his house. He was taking in the full tactical and social picture before engaging. As Wallace began to walk toward them, Chad saw his opportunity to seize control of the narrative. He broke away from his wife and strode purposefully to meet the sergeant halfway. "Sergeant, thank God you're here," he began, launching into his well-rehearsed speech. "This man was trying to steal that car, and your officers have been trying to get him to cooperate, but he's been nothing but trouble. Argumentative, hostile, a real professional agitator." Sergeant Wallace held up a hand, a simple, almost lazy gesture that nonetheless carried an undeniable weight of authority. It instantly silenced Chad. "I'll get to you in a moment, sir," Wallace said, his voice calm but firm. He didn't dismiss Chad, but he made it unequivocally clear that he, not the civilian complainant, was now in control of the scene. He walked past Chad without a second glance and addressed his officers first, his tone all business. "Keegan, talk to me. What's going on?" Officer Keegan, standing stiffly at attention, immediately launched into his version of events. It was a masterful piece of spin, containing just enough truth to be plausible while omitting every detail of his own misconduct. "Sarge, we got a 911 call for a possible 10-53V auto theft in progress," he reported, using the official police code. "These folks here," he gestured towards Chad and Brittany, "were the complainants. We arrived on scene, found the subject matching the description standing by the vehicle. He's been uncooperative from the start, refused to provide ID, became belligerent when we questioned him." "Did you run the plate?" Sergeant Wallace asked, his first question cutting straight to the most glaring procedural hole. Keegan hesitated for a fraction of a second. "We were in the process of securing the scene. Sarge, subject was being evasive, and the complainant stated he was aggressive and possibly armed. Officer safety was the priority." It was a weak excuse, and they both knew it. Securing the scene and running a plate were not mutually exclusive. In fact, the latter was a key part of the former. Wallace's expression didn't change. He absorbed the information without comment, then turned his full attention to David for the first time. His gaze was different from Keegan and Shaw's. It wasn't accusatory or suspicious. It was analytical. It was curious. "Sir, I'm Sergeant Wallace. I understand there's been some disagreement here." "Sergeant," David replied, his voice still even, but imbued with a new sense of hope. He had a professional to talk to now. "There's been no disagreement on my part. There's been a false accusation and an unprofessional response. My name is David Sterling. I own this home and the 1968 Ford Mustang in the driveway. I was working on my car when that man," he nodded towards Chad, "approached me and accused me of trying to steal it. His wife then called 911 and, I can only assume, lied about me being aggressive to elicit this response." He paused, letting the words sink in before continuing. "Your officers arrived and, without any form of investigation, treated me as a felony suspect. They refused my repeated suggestions to run the license plate, which would have resolved this immediately. They instead chose to interrogate me about my profession and my finances. When I asserted my rights, they threatened to arrest me. The report you just heard from Officer Keegan is not an accurate summary of events." Wallace listened patiently, his eyes moving from David to the Mustang to Keegan and then back to David. The two stories were in direct, irreconcilable conflict. One side was lying, or at least grossly misrepresenting the facts. His job was to find out which. Officer Keegan stated you refused to provide identification, Wallace said, focusing on a key point of contention. That is false, Sergeant, David stated clearly. I informed the officers that my ID was in my wallet and offered to retrieve it. They were more interested in asking me if I was armed. At no point did I refuse to provide identification. In fact, I invited them to check it. Wallace's eyes narrowed slightly. This was a specific, verifiable claim. Body cameras, he knew, would eventually tell the tale. But for now, he had to cut through the noise with good, old-fashioned police work. He turned back to his officers. Shaw, what's your take? Just like Keegan said. Sarge, Shaw piped up, eager to back his partner. He was being a lawyer with us the whole time, talking about his rights, refusing to follow orders. He never offered us any ID. It was a direct contradiction, a clear lie. Sergeant Wallace had been a cop for 30 years. He had seen rookies lie to cover for their partners 1,000 times. He had also developed a keen instinct for reading people, and the calm, precise man in the driveway did not present like a cornered car thief. He presented like a man who was deeply, profoundly wronged. Wallace made a decision. He would end this, one way or another. Right now? He looked back at David. Sir? You say your name is David Sterling and you have identification in your wallet? I do. Sergeant, David confirmed. Would you be willing to show it to me now? Wallace asked. It was a polite request, not a barked command. The change in tone was a world of difference. Yes, I would, David said. Wallace glanced at Keegan and Shaw. Stand by, he told them. A quiet order for them to hold their positions and do nothing. He then nodded at David. All right, sir. You can go ahead and retrieve it. Please do so slowly, so there are no misunderstandings. With the supervisor's permission, under the watchful eyes of the two hostile officers and the curious neighbors, David reached slowly and deliberately into his back right pocket. The small crowd, which had grown by one or two more curious onlookers, inched forward, sensing a turning point. This was the moment of truth. The fate of the entire morning now rested on the small, laminated piece of plastic that David was about to produce. David pulled his worn leather wallet from his back pocket. The movement was slow, deliberate, every motion calculated to be as non-threatening as possible. He held the wallet in his palm, opened it, and with his thumb and forefinger, slid out his state-issued driver's license. He held it out for Sergeant Wallace to take. Wallace took the small plastic card. His gaze dropped down, scanning the familiar layout, the state seal, the address, the date of birth. He saw the name printed in bold, capital letters, Sterling, David A. He glanced at the address, 112 Willow Creek Lane, which matched the house behind David. He then looked at the photograph, a standard government-issue portrait, and saw it was an exact match for the calm, composed man standing before him. This should have been the end of it. The proof was right there in his hand. The man was who he said he was. He lived where he said he lived. The car theft allegation was demonstrably false. A simple apology for the misunderstanding was in order, followed by a stern talking to for his officers and a potential citation for the couple who made the false report. But as Wallace was about to hand the license back, his professional eye, trained by decades of service to notice details others missed, caught something else. Tucked just behind the driver's license in the wallet's clear plastic sleeve was another piece of identification. It was of a similar size and shape, but its design was different. It was dark blue, with a formal city crest embossed in gold in the center. It looked official, important. Wallace's expression, which had been neutral and professional, flickered. It was a micro-expression, a brief widening of the eyes, a subtle intake of breath that was almost imperceptible. But David saw it. He knew the moment Wallace's brain registered that second card. "Sir," Wallace said, his voice suddenly more cautious, more respectful. He held up the wallet slightly. "Would you mind if I took a closer look at that other card in there?" "Not at all, Sergeant," David replied. Slowly, David took his wallet back, used his thumb to expertly slide the second ID card out from behind his license, and handed it over. This one was heavier, more substantial. It wasn't a flimsy piece of plastic. It was a high-quality, official credential, encased in a protective layer. Sergeant Wallace took it. He held it in both hands now, as if weighing its significance. He read the words printed on it, his lips moving silently at first. Then he read them again, his brain struggling to process the information, to reconcile the impossible reality of what he was holding with the scene playing out in this quiet, suburban driveway. Oak Creek Police Department. The crest was their own, Chief of Police. The title was the highest in the department, David A. Sterling. The name belonged to the man his officers had just been about to forcibly arrest. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. The sounds of the neighborhood, the distant lawnmower, the chirping of birds, the rustle of leaves in the breeze, all faded into a dull, rushing roar in Wallace's ears. He looked up from the ID, his face a mask of utter, profound disbelief. The man his officers had threatened, the man they had accused of being a car thief, the man they had treated with such open contempt and suspicion, was not just a citizen. He wasn't just a homeowner. He was the new chief of police. He was their boss, their boss's boss. He was the absolute highest authority in the entire department. Wallace swallowed hard, a dry, clicking sound in the sudden silence. "This," he started, his voice a hoarse whisper. Are you?" "I was sworn in last month," David said, his voice devoid of any triumph or malice. He was simply stating a fact. "I took a few weeks to get my affairs in order before my official start date, which, as it happens, is this Monday." He paused for a beat. "I haven't had the chance to meet everyone yet." Sergeant Wallace looked as though he had been struck by lightning. His 30 years on the force, his experience in 100 different tense situations, had not prepared him for this. His professional composure, the bedrock of his career, completely evaporated, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated shock that bordered on horror. He looked from the credential in his hand to David's calm face, then over at his two officers, Keegan and Shaw, who were watching him with growing confusion. They couldn't see the details on the ID from where they stood. They only saw their sergeant, a man they knew to be unflappable, frozen in place, staring at a small plastic card as if it were a venomous snake, without a word to them. Wallace turned and walked a few paces away, toward the street, as if he needed to put distance between himself and the scene to process the information. He pulled out his personal cell phone, his fingers fumbling slightly as he tapped the screen. He put the phone to his ear, his back turned to the group. His voice was low, almost a mumble, but fragments of his side of the conversation carried on the still morning air. "Captain Miller." "It's Wallace." "Yeah, I'm on a call on Willow Creek. Listen, I know this is a weird question on a Saturday, but the new chief, Sterling, I need a description." "Yeah, David Sterling. What does he look like?" Okay, I understand." He hung up the phone. He stood with his back to them for a long moment, his shoulders slumping slightly as the full, crushing weight of the situation landed on him. This wasn't just a bad call. This wasn't just a citizen complaint waiting to happen. This was a 5-alarm fire, a political and professional minefield, and his officers had just tap-danced right into the middle of it with gasoline-soaked boots. They hadn't just made a mistake. They had committed a catastrophic, career-ending blunder of historical proportions. He turned around slowly, his face pale, his expression grim. He walked back toward the group, the chief's credentials still held carefully in his hand as if it were a holy relic. He stopped directly in front of his two officers. "Keegan, Shaw," he said, his voice low and strained. "Do you have any idea who this is?" Keegan squinted, still not grasping the magnitude of the situation. "Some kind of city official?" he guessed, annoyance still coloring his tone. Shaw leaned in, his eyes widening as he finally got a clear look at the ID in his sergeant's hand. He read the words under the crest. His face went slack, the color draining from it in an instant. He looked from the ID to David and back again, his mouth opening and closing silently like a fish out of water. He took an involuntary step backward. Wallace didn't wait for Keegan to figure it out. He let the silence hang for one more pregnant beat. Then he delivered the blow. "This," he said, his voice suddenly clear and resonant, cutting through the parking lot air for all to hear, "is Chief David Sterling, our new chief of police." The words landed with the force of a physical explosion. Officer Keegan froze mid-breath, his entire body going rigid. The cynical scowl that seemed permanently etched onto his face dissolved into a blank mask of pure, uncomprehending shock. The handcuffs, still clipped to his belt, suddenly seemed to weigh 1,000 pounds. Across the street, Tom's smug expression faltered. "Chief of police?" he scoffed, a short, dismissive bark of a laugh. "Oh, come on. That's the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard. You're not actually falling for that, are you? He probably bought that online." Sergeant Wallace turned his head slowly, his eyes locking onto Tom with a gaze as cold and hard as granite. "Sir," he said, his voice dangerously quiet, "I am not falling for anything. I have just confirmed it. This is Chief Sterling, and you," he took a step toward him, "are in a world of trouble." Jessica's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with dawning horror. The reality of what they had done, the monumental scale of their misjudgment, began to crash down on her. The man they had accused, insulted, and tried to have arrested wasn't just an innocent citizen. He was the highest-ranking law enforcement officer in the entire city. An absolute, profound silence descended upon the group. The onlookers fell quiet, their expressions a mixture of shock and disbelief. This was a twist no one could have seen coming. The entire power dynamic of the encounter had not just shifted, it had been utterly and irrevocably shattered. The silence that followed Sergeant Wallace's confirmation was absolute. It was as if the entire neighborhood was holding its collective breath. The only sound was the faint rustle of leaves in a nearby oak tree. Officer Keegan stood as if petrified, his mind struggling to reboot. The world had been turned upside down. The suspect he had been threatening and preparing to arrest was the man who could, with the stroke of a pen, end his career. The man he had treated with such contempt was the one who would now be reviewing his conduct, his body camera footage, his entire professional life. Officer Shaw looked physically ill. A sheen of sweat had popped out on his forehead, and he seemed to be actively shrinking, trying to make himself as small and unnoticeable as possible. He avoided looking at Chief Sterling, instead staring at the ground as if it held the answers to how his life had so spectacularly derailed in the last 20 minutes. Chief Sterling, for his part, remained the calm center of the storm he had unleashed. He simply took his credential back from the stunned sergeant and slid it neatly back into his wallet. He then slipped the wallet into his back pocket. His expression had not changed. There was no hint of triumph, no, "I told you so, you." There was only a deep, profound weariness and a palpable sense of disappointment. He looked at Keegan, and for the first time, Keegan saw the man not as a suspect, but as the leader who now held his entire future in the palm of his hand. "Sir, Chief," Keegan stammered, his voice a strangled, weak version of its former self. We were just following procedure based on the 911 call." It was a pathetic, reflexive attempt at justification, and it sounded hollow even to his own ears. "We will have a very detailed discussion about what you consider to be procedure on Monday morning." "Officer," Sterling said, his voice quiet but carrying the immense weight of his new authority. He then looked at Shaw, who flinched as if he'd been physically struck. "Both of you." He turned to Sergeant Wallace. "Sergeant, thank you for responding." "Of course. Chief." "Absolutely." Wallace stammered, snapping back to attention. He was still reeling, but his training kicked in. There was a command officer on scene. His command officer. "Is there anything you need? Anything at all?" "No, Sergeant," Sterling replied. "My property is all here." He gestured to his wallet and keys. "I was about to take my car for a drive. I'd like to do that now." Wallace practically jumped out of the way, creating a clear path for him. "Yes, sir. Of course." He then turned to his stunned officers. "Keegan, Shaw, back to your vehicle. Now." The officers, moving like wooden automatons, turned and trudged back to their patrol car, their shoulders slumped in defeat, before getting into his Mustang. Chief Sterling paused and looked back, not at the officers, but at Chad and Brittany, who were frozen on the edge of their lawn in a state of pure, terrified shock. "You two," he said, his voice soft, yet every word a hammer blow. "You initiated a police response based on a series of lies. You knowingly fabricated a story that could have gotten an innocent man hurt, or worse. That action has consequences." He let the words hang in the air for a moment. "You will be hearing from us." He then slid into the driver's seat of the Mustang. With a turn of the key, the V8 engine roared to life, a deep, powerful rumble that seemed to shake the very foundations of the quiet suburban street. Without a single backward glance at the scene of professional and personal devastation he was leaving behind, Chief David Sterling pulled out of his driveway and drove away, the cherry-red car disappearing down the sun-drenched street, leaving a shattered silence in its wake. Sergeant Wallace watched him go, then took a deep, steadying breath. His shock was quickly being replaced by a grim sense of duty. A catastrophic incident had occurred on his watch. The cleanup would be immense, and it started right now. He turned his full, undivided attention to the pale, trembling couple who had lit the fuse on this entire disaster. His expression was no longer that of a mediator. It was that of a lead investigator arriving at a crime scene. "I'm going to need both of your names and official identification," he said, his voice cold and hard as iron. "I will be taking your formal statements now, separately." The moment the Mustang disappeared, Sergeant Wallace became a man of grim, efficient purpose. He instructed Keegan and Shaw, who sat stunned in their patrol car, to remain on scene but not to move, talk, or turn off their body cameras. He then methodically went about the process of taking official, recorded statements from a terrified Chad and a sobbing Brittany. Their stories, once so bold and certain, now crumbled under his professional, dispassionate questioning. They were filled with contradictions, backtrackings, and feeble attempts to reframe their lies as misperceptions. Chad's claim that he saw David jimmying something became, "It sort of looked like he was fiddling with the door." Brittany's report of aggressive yelling became, "He had a firm tone of voice." Her lie about a potential weapon was explained away as a moment of panic. Wallace documented every inconsistency. By the time he cleared the scene, the wheels of justice, both internal and external, were already turning at a speed rarely seen. The incident report he filed flagged for its involvement of command staff, landed on the desk of the head of internal affairs before the end of the day. Within 48 hours, Officers Keegan and Shaw were summoned to the sterile offices of the Office of Professional Standards. They were placed on immediate administrative leave, stripped of their badges and service weapons, and escorted from the building pending a full investigation. The body camera footage was the primary evidence, and it was irrefutable. It was a textbook example of bias-driven policing, procedural failure, and abuse of authority. Their careers were, for all intents and purposes, over. Simultaneously, Sergeant Wallace's report was forwarded to the Oak Ridge County District Attorney's Office. District Attorney Maria Flores, a sharp and ambitious prosecutor, saw the case not just as a false report, but as a profound abuse of the 911 system and a clear-cut case of malicious harassment based on racial prejudice. Formal charges were filed against Chad and Brittany Miller for filing a false police report and maliciously summoning an emergency response. Their names were released to the media, and the story exploded. They became local pariahs, the faces of a modern cautionary tale about prejudice, their lives consumed by legal fees, public shaming, and the very real possibility of a criminal record. But, for Chief David Sterling, the consequences for the officers and the couple were not the end of the story. They were merely the beginning. He hadn't endured that humiliating ordeal just to see 4 people punished. He had endured it to force a change. 2 weeks after the incident, he called a mandatory meeting for his entire command staff, captains, lieutenants, and sergeants, in the precinct's main briefing room. He stood before them. "Good morning," he began, his voice calm and steady. 2 weeks ago, I was the victim of a crime in this city. The crime was not auto theft. It was the filing of a false police report, motivated by racial bias. But the bigger failure that day was not committed by those 2 civilians. It was committed by our own. He then played the body camera footage. All of it, uncut, unedited. The room was deathly silent as the command staff watched the raw, ugly reality of the encounter. They saw their officers ignore procedure, escalate a situation with aggression, and treat a citizen with contempt. When the video ended, a grim silence hung in the room. "The most troubling part of this," Sterling said, his voice low but powerful, "is that if I hadn't been the chief of police, the outcome would have been tragically different. I would have been arrested. I would have been charged. And given that I was legally armed, I could have been killed. All for the crime of working on my own car, in my own driveway." He let that sink in. "My job title is the only thing that saved me, and that is a fundamental, catastrophic failure of this department. A citizen's safety and their rights should not depend on their job title. They should depend on our unwavering commitment to fair, impartial, and constitutional policing. That commitment failed, and it will not fail again." In the months that followed, he instituted the most sweeping reforms the department had ever seen. De-escalation training became a mandatory, hands-on quarterly requirement. A new duty to intervene policy was enacted, making it an officer's explicit responsibility to stop another officer from misconduct. He created a new system for reviewing citizen complaints, looking for the kind of patterns that had been ignored in Officer Keegan's file for years. The incident on Willow Creek Lane became a crucible, a painful but necessary reckoning that forced the department to confront its deepest flaws. It was the beginning of a long, difficult road, but it was a beginning nonetheless, forged in the fire of one man's unjust ordeal and his unwavering resolve to ensure no one else would have to endure the same. To truly understand what happened on that sun-drenched driveway, we have to look beyond the events themselves and into the psychology that fueled them. What drove Chad and Brittany Two people who would likely never describe themselves as racist to act with such baseless, destructive conviction? It wasn't a conscious, mustache-twirling villainy. It was something far more common and insidious, a potent cocktail of implicit bias, privilege, and a deep-seated fear of anything that disrupts their perceived world order. In their minds, a black man in casual clothes with a luxury classic car in their neighborhood was an anomaly, a variable that didn't fit the equation of their safe, homogeneous life. Their 911 call wasn't just a report. It was an attempt to summon an authority that would restore their version of normalcy, to forcibly remove the puzzle piece they deemed out of place. Their fear, whether genuine or performative, served as a license to abandon reason and embrace a prejudice they would never admit to possessing. We must also consider the razor's edge upon which this outcome was balanced by asking the difficult what-if questions. What if David Sterling had not spent 2 decades cultivating an almost superhuman level of emotional control? What if he had let the righteous anger show, raising his voice or making a sudden, frustrated gesture? The officers were primed for aggression, looking for any excuse to validate the 911 caller's lies. A single misstep could have transformed him from uncooperative to resisting, giving them the justification they desperately sought to use force. What if there had been no other neighbor watching? No impartial witness to lend credence to his story? The narrative would have been his word against that of 2 officers and 2 concerned citizens. A battle an ordinary man would almost certainly lose. The ultimate lesson here transcends this single event. It speaks to a broader truth about the nature of justice and accountability. It reminds us that our character is not defined by how we act when things are easy, but how we choose to act when faced with the unfamiliar and the uncomfortable. It is about the courage to question our own initial assumptions, the integrity to seek the truth over a convenient narrative, and the resolve to turn a moment of personal injustice into a catalyst for systemic change. This story found a resolution because of the extraordinary character of its victim, but countless others do not. It begs us to consider what we would have done in that situation. If you were a neighbor that day, what would you have done? Would you have pulled out your phone to record, spoken up, or simply closed your blinds and walked away? And more importantly, what can we all do in our own communities to ensure that a person's rights are never dependent on the title they hold, but are guaranteed by the integrity of the system meant to protect us all? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Your voice is crucial in keeping these important conversations alive.